The appraisal came back on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1984, and Roy Mercer slid it across the desk without much of a lead up. He turned it so Nathan Kline could read the line without having to reach for it. The line was circled in red. It read, 31 acres, wet ground, no contributory value. The bank can't lend against cattails, Nathan, Roy said. Nathan looked at the line longer than he needed to. He wasn't surprised by it. He had expected worse. That's the wet meadow, he said. That's 31 acres out of 100, Roy said. I can only carry the other 69 as collateral. Upland pasture, the 10-acre ridge, that's what the bank sees. What about the willow ground? Brush, same as always. Roy tapped the page. This isn't personal. I've got a formula. Wet ground with poor drainage and no crop history doesn't score. Nathan folded the appraisal once and put it inside his coat. He didn't argue with Roy Mercer. There wasn't much in the report to argue with. The ground did flood in March. The cattails did run thick through the low third of the property. 3 men before him had tried to do something with the Meeker Bottom, and 3 men had walked away from it. He drove to the feed store in Garnet Crossing that afternoon for wire and fence staples, and somebody had already heard. Carl Bremer was leaning against the counter with a sack of mineral over one shoulder, and he looked up when the bell on the door rang. Heard you closed on the Meeker place, Carl said. Closed Friday, Nathan said. You know what that ground does to a tractor. I've heard. I lost a rear tire to that mud in 71. Had to walk 2 miles for a chain. Carl shook his head like the memory still bothered him. You can't graze mud, Nathan. Nathan paid for the wire and didn't answer that one directly. He'd heard some version of it 4 times already that week, and he'd learned there wasn't much use responding to it. The men saying it weren't wrong about what they'd seen. They just hadn't looked at the same ground he had. He was 38 years old, and until March he'd been renting 60 acres of pasture from a man named Otto Dressler, who'd sold the whole farm out from under him to a hog operation from 2 counties over. Nathan had 31 cow-calf pairs and nowhere to put them by June. He'd looked at every parcel within 20 miles that a man with his kind of money could afford, and every one of them was either too small, too far, or already leased. The Meeker Bottom had been for sale for 14 months. Nobody had made an offer on it. The county plat called it seasonally saturated. The bank's own file on the property going back to 1968 had 2 prior loan applications marked declined insufficient collateral value. Nathan bought it for $21,000, $210 an acre, at a time when clean upland pasture 2 sections over was running $420. He put $4,200 down and financed the rest against his equipment and the cattle themselves, since the bank wouldn't count the ground. He had spent 9 years on the county drainage crew before he started running cattle full-time. He'd dug ditches, replaced culverts, opened tile lines that had been silted shut for decades, and pulled trucks out of flooded township roads more times than he could count. He knew what wet ground looked like when it was simply wet, and he'd started to suspect the Meeker Bottom wasn't that. He walked it for the first time as the owner on a Sunday morning in late April, with a notebook in his shirt pocket, the same kind he used for breeding dates and vet bills. The wet meadow wasn't uniform. That was the first thing he wrote down. Cattails didn't cover all 31 acres evenly. They ran in a shape closer to a crescent, thick along the north edge, thinning out fast toward the ridge, and almost absent in 2 low pockets that should have held the most water of anywhere on the place. A line of willow ran along the western edge of the meadow, cutting across the slope instead of running with it. Willow didn't grow in a line like that unless there was water moving sideways underground, not just sitting in a low spot. Up on the 10-acre ridge, in the strip where the upland pasture met the meadow, there was a stretch of grass that didn't match the broom sedge around it. It was thinner, but it was orchard grass, old and half choked out, the kind of thing somebody had seeded on purpose 30 or 40 years back and then let go. And along the ridge itself, worn into the ground just enough to still be visible, there was a path, not a cow path made in a season, a path made over years, curving around the wet ground instead of cutting through it. Nathan stood at the top of that path for a while before he wrote anything else down. He went back the following weekend and brought Wes Hollander with him. Wes had run the county drainage crew for 26 years before he retired, and he'd trained Nathan on his first job. Wes was 71 that spring, walked with a hickory cane he'd cut himself, and hadn't lost the habit of reading ground the way some men read a newspaper. Wes stood at the edge of the cattails for a long time without saying anything. Then he pointed his cane at the crescent shape. "That's not a swamp," he said. "That's a spring trying to be a pasture." "How do you mean?" "A swamp sits everywhere the same. This isn't sitting everywhere the same. Something's feeding it from one direction, and something's letting it go slow in another." Wes worked his way down toward the north edge, testing the ground with the cane as he went. "You've got a seep up on that ridge, most likely. Comes down through a clay pan, spreads out, and the meadow's been catching it and holding it instead of running it off. There's an old ditch back along the fence line. Silted in pretty bad. Course there is. Somebody tried to drain this 50 years ago and gave up before they finished." Wes looked at him. "Most men drain wet ground because they hate being stuck. Your job is to ask why it stayed wet when everything else dried." Nathan wrote that down word for word. He spent the rest of that spring reading the ground the way Wes had taught him to, one detail at a time. He noticed frost melted off the crescent strip a full day before it melted anywhere else on the property, which meant the ground underneath was warmer than the air, which meant water was moving through it even in March. He noticed that after 19 days without rain in early June, most of the upland had started going pale. But a band of sedge through the middle of the meadow was still green enough to reflect the morning light. He didn't tell Carl Bremer any of this. He didn't tell Royce Mercer either. He wrote it in the notebook and kept the notebook in his shirt pocket, the way his father would have, if his father had been the kind of man who wrote things down. By July, Nathan had a plan that looked nothing like what anybody expected. Everyone in Garnet Crossing who'd heard about the Meeker Bottom assumed there was only one thing a sensible man could do with 31 wet acres, and that was drain it dry as fast as money allowed, the way the second owner had tried and failed to do back in the 70s. Nathan hired a backhoe out of Milan for one day in August, and Carl Bremer happened to drive past while it was working. He pulled his truck onto the shoulder and got out to look. "That's not much of a ditch," Carl said. "It's not supposed to be much." The backhoe was cutting a shallow channel along the upper edge of the meadow, 18 to 24 inches deep, angled to catch the overflow before it spread into a sheet across the low ground and turned it into standing mud. "That won't dry a boot track," Carl said. "I'm not trying to dry it," Nathan said. Carl didn't have a response ready for that one. He watched the backhoe for another minute, shook his head, and got back in his truck. What Nathan was building wasn't a drainage system, it was a control system. The shallow diversion kept water from pooling in sheets where cattle would sink. Behind it, he ran cross-fencing through the meadow and the ridge, cutting the ground into 6 paddocks so he could move cattle through in a rotation instead of turning them loose on the whole thing at once. Where the ground crossed from firm to soft, he built a lane out of gravel and old railroad ties he bought from a salvage yard in Bethany, so the herd had a solid path to water and to the higher pasture instead of cutting their own trail straight through the softest ground. On the 18 acres where the upland met the wet edge, the ground that had shown him the old orchard grass in the warmest frost line, he had a soil test run and limed it that fall. He seeded it with a mix of orchard grass, red clover, and reed canary grass in the lowest strips, and timothy where the ground stayed firmer. He didn't touch the deepest part of the cattail meadow at all. Wes had told him not to. "You go in there and drain the middle of it," Wes said. "You'll dry out the very thing that's keeping the edges alive in August. Leave the swamp a swamp, fix the edges." First-year costs came to $3,805, $720 for the diversion ditch, $1,180 for used posts and wire, $640 for the gravel lane, $760 for seed, $410 for soil testing and lime, $95 for a used stock tank he found at an estate sale outside Bethany. It did not go well. 2 heifers wandered off the gravel lane in May, before the cross-fencing was finished on the far paddock and sank to their hocks in a soft pocket near the cattail edge. Nathan spent most of an afternoon with a come-along and a length of chain getting them out, and one of them limped for 2 weeks afterward. The seed on the lowest strip of the 18 acres rotted before it could establish. The claypan held water too close to the surface there, closer than Nathan had accounted for, and the orchard grass drowned before it had roots deep enough to survive. By September, only about 11 of the 18 seeded acres had a stand worth calling pasture. The rest was thin, patchy, or bare. Carl saw it from the road that fall and didn't pass up the chance. He spent money teaching cattails to be pasture. Carl told the counter at the feed store, loud enough that it got back to Nathan within the week. Roy Mercer wasn't any kinder about it, though he wasn't unkind either. When Nathan's operating note came up for its winter review, Roy looked over what had been done to the property and told him plainly that a season of fencing and a thin stand didn't move the number. "There's no production record here," Roy said. "I see money spent. I don't see income." Nathan's sister Ellen kept the books for him, the way she had since their father died, and she sat across the kitchen table from him that December, with the ledger open between them. "You're 5 months from having to sell 12 cows if the spring doesn't turn around," she said. "How long can you keep proving people wrong before the bank proves them right?" Nathan didn't have a good answer for her that night. He looked at the numbers the same way he'd looked at them before he bought the place, and he came to the same conclusion he'd come to then, which was that the math had never been about all 31 acres of wet meadow. It had been about the 11 acres that had already shown him they would hold, and about a spring seep that had been feeding that ground long before anyone alive had a name for it. He stopped trying to fix everything he'd planned to fix. He put his attention into protecting the 11 acres that were working, kept cattle off the failed seeding until it had a full season to try again, and left the middle of the cattail meadow exactly the way Wes had told him to leave it. The summer of 1985 answered the question that mattered. It came on dry in June and stayed that way. By the middle of July, ponds across Harrison County that usually held into September were down to cracked mud at the edges. Hay that had gone for $58 a ton in May was pushing $80 by the first week of August. Carl Bremer, who had never bought a bale of hay before October in his life, was pricing loads by the last week of July. The upland pasture on the Meeker Bottom went the same dull brown as everything else in the county. The 10-acre ridge Nathan had bought along with the wet ground gave out almost entirely by early August, but the 11 acres along the meadow edge held, not lush, not green the way it had been in a wet spring, but holding, the orchard grass and clover still standing while everything around it had gone to straw. The claypan that had drowned his first seeding in a wet year was now doing the opposite. It was keeping just enough moisture within reach of the roots to get them through a dry one. Nathan moved cattle through the 6 paddocks in a slow rotation that summer, never letting the herd hit any one section long enough to set it back the way the flood-damaged ground had been set back the year before. Across the driest 38 days on record for that part of the county, the Meeker Bottom carried 24 cow-calf pairs for 31 grazing days on ground that had been marked no contributory value on a bank appraisal 15 months earlier. He didn't buy hay that August. He ran the numbers afterward, the way he'd run them before he ever put a shovel in the ground. The grazing he got out of those 11 acres, measured against what he'd have had to buy to cover the same gap, came to roughly 38 tons of hay at $72 a ton, $2,736 he didn't spend. He hadn't hauled water either, not to that pasture, and at $36 a day for 28 of the driest days, that was another $1,008 he kept in his pocket that a lot of his neighbors didn't. Total avoided cost for the summer came to $3,744 against a first-year investment of $3,805. The math hadn't turned a profit yet. It had turned a corner. Carl Bremer's own pasture on the south lot gave out entirely by the 3rd week of August. He was hauling water to 14 pairs on rented ground and pricing hay he couldn't really afford, and one evening near the end of the month he drove out to the Meeker Bottom instead of just past it. He didn't stop at the road this time. He opened the gate and walked in, his boots sinking slightly at the edge of the lane before finding the gravel. He stood next to Nathan and watched the herd graze a paddock that had been mud 2 Augusts before. "I've got 12 pairs on the south lot and no grass left," Carl said. Nathan didn't make him ask twice. "What would you charge me?" Carl said. "You helped me pull 2 heifers out of that low pocket last spring," Nathan said. "Call it even for the first week." Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was wrong about this place." "You were right about the mud," Nathan said. "You were wrong about what it meant." Carl ended up paying for grazing after that first free week. 14 pairs, 12 days, $1.25 per pair per day, $210 total. It wasn't much money. What it did to the talk at the feed store mattered more than the check did. Roy Mercer sent an appraiser back out that November, not as a favor, but because the operating loan was up for its annual review, and Nathan had 2 seasons of soil tests, lime receipts, fencing invoices, and a full summer of grazing records to put in front of him. The appraiser walked the ground with Nathan on a cold, clear morning with the meadow gone dormant and brown, the way wet ground looks in November, no green crescent showing, because there wasn't supposed to be one that time of year. Nathan walked him to the north edge anyway and showed him the diversion ditch, still carrying a slow, steady flow, even in the cold. "Where's this coming from?" the appraiser asked. "Same place it was coming from when your office called it worthless," Nathan said. "Nobody walked this far to check." The appraiser didn't argue with that. He wrote down what he saw. A managed wet meadow with a shallow diversion controlling seasonal overflow. Cross-fenced paddocks supporting rotational grazing, 11 acres of established forage on ground that had failed to establish the year before, and a full season's grazing record showing 24 pairs carried through the driest stretch on the county's rain gauge in 30 years. The new appraisal didn't read the way the old one had. It read, "Managed wet meadow pasture with developed seasonal grazing value. The land value moved from $210 an acre to $365. On 100 acres, that was a jump from $21,000 to $36,500, $15,500 on paper, enough for Roy Mercer to renew the operating note that winter, without the conversation about selling down the herd that Nathan had been bracing for since the day the red pen first circled that line. Wes Hollander died the following spring, before he saw a full second summer play out on the ground he'd taught Nathan to read. Nathan kept the probe rod Wes had carried on the drainage crew for 26 years, and it still hangs on a nail inside the barn, next to a scrap of plywood where Nathan wrote a line in paint the year the bank changed its mind. It reads, "Don't fix the land before you understand what it's trying to do." The bank never apologized for the appraisal Roy Mercer slid across the desk in April of 1984. There was no reason they should have. The ground had flooded in March. Tractors had gotten stuck there for 15 years running. An appraiser working from a plat map and a drive-by inspection had no way of knowing that a crescent of cattails, a line of willow, and a worn path along a ridge were telling him something the wet acreage never could on its own. The number changed because the field made a record, and the record was the only thing a bank had ever been built to read. Roy Mercer had seen cattails on a plat map. Nathan Kline had seen a spring trying to be a pasture, and he'd had a reason to believe it before he had any proof that it was true. In a summer when brown pasture cost half the county money it didn't have, 11 acres of managed wet ground were enough to prove the Meeker Bottom had been read wrong from the very start. The Meeker Bottom never became the driest pasture in Harrison County. That was the point. In a year when everything dry turned brown, the farm everyone called too wet was the only ground that still remembered how to stay alive. If you're finding these useful, there's a subscribe button below. One decision a week with the real numbers. The bank saw cattails on a map. Nathan saw a spring trying to be a pasture. Would you have bought the farm everyone else spent 20 years trying not to own?